gloves are already off, with both Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton slinging personal attacks across the battle lines.
Peter Dutton is very angry after receiving brutal insults from Anthony Albanese.
Now, you've called Mr Albanese the weakest Prime Minister we've had since Federation.
You ripped $80 billion out of those two items in 2014.
Prime Minister, you couldn't lie straight in bed, honestly. This is unbelievable.
You can go to abuse.
No, well, it's just,
you can
it's
go
just
to
the
personal
reality.
abuse. That's a sign of desperation.
I believe that we've got a very strong chance at the next election. A first-term government hasn't lost since 1931, but there's not been a worse government in Australia's history since 1931 than this one.
There's been so much mudslinging this campaign. We know it's what they're about. Prime Minister, you've called Mr Dutton mean-spirited and cold-hearted. What are three things you admire about him?
Three.
After months of trading insults, kissing babies, shaking hands and debating policies, the leaders of the major Australian political parties will likely find out tomorrow who will be the country's next Prime Minister.
Pre-polling began this week with a record 500,000 nerds casting their vote on the first day alone.
Thank you for being a part of democracy.
Oh, no worries.
Do you feel confident with the Liberals or with the Independent?
I'm not confident in anyone.
Why is that?
Because I have no idea.
Let's face it, he's not alone. So on the eve of the Australian elections, the Detail will have everything you do need to know. Who's who, who's likely to win, the quirks, the Trump effect, the controversies and the policies.
Cost of living, Medicare, energy prices. So far this election has been defined by hip pocket expenses and household budgets.
Patricia, what will sort of decide this election? What are the dominant issues across the ditch?
Well, I say this, and it's such a cliche, but I'm going to say it anyway. It's like, it's cost of living, cost of living, cost of living, cost of living. It really is.
Kia ora, I'm Amanda Gillies, and today I'm joined by top Australian political correspondent and Q&A host Patricia Karvelas to talk all things Australian election. Tomorrow is, of course, D-Day, with the polls closing at 6 p.m. sharp Aussie time. The two main contenders are Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton. Albanese is the incumbent for the Labor Party.
Labor's plan is to build Australia's future and to build your family's future.
Dutton is the leader of the Liberal Party.
At the moment, Australians, of course, are going to the polls, and people have been out voting today, and this election is incredibly important. Over the course of the last 3 years, people have gone through the biggest drop in living standards in any other country compared to any other country in the world. We need to make sure that we can get our country back on track, that we can help manage the economy.
The election is tomorrow. Patricia, we're on the eve of that. Who are you picking to win? Who is ahead in the latest polls?
Well, the polls all are moving in one direction. So the trend is Labor's friend, and Labor are currently in government. They've only been in government for one term. The public polling says that Anthony Albanese is set to either retain government in minority or potentially majority. But the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, has been saying that the private polling for the Liberal Party is more positive in some key areas. So I think, you know, I'm a pretty cautious person. I've seen polling get things wrong before. But, as I say, the trend is the incumbent's friend. And after the victory of Mark Carney in Canada, where, the incumbents were apparently on the way out there, and then Donald Trump changed everything.
Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney has declared victory in the country's general election, seen as one of the most consequential in its history. The Liberal Party were well behind in the polls just 3 months ago, but that was before Carney replaced Justin Trudeau as leader and US President Donald Trump upended relations and became the defining issue of the campaign.
President Trump is trying to break us so that America can own us. That will never, ever happen.
I would say that the Trump bump is having an impact in Australia as well.
Because Dutton, just a few months ago, he seemed like a shoo-in, didn't he? And is that the Donald Trump effect that has hindered his chances now?
Well, I think you're right that it was reported that he was ahead because he had really dominated the agenda and outperformed in a really short space of time. And so the kind of the mood of the nation, if you like, was on his side. But I always thought, if I can be very frank in this podcast with you, that it was an inflated idea. The idea that Peter Dutton was a shoo-in after just one term of a new government was always a little too good to be true for Peter Dutton. If you just look at historical precedent, that is very unlikely to happen. And what has always surprised me is that Peter Dutton hasn't discouraged the view. And the reason I find that so surprising is I'm not sure when we analyse this, whatever the result is, anyone will think that worked in his favour. He set expectations very high for himself. He needs to win 19 seats to form majority government. That's extraordinary, right, in one term. Australians only kicked out the government he was part of 3 years ago. So I always thought those expectations were too high. The Labor comeback, I think, at least in the polls, we won't know, as you say, the election's tomorrow, but in some ways matches the times globally as well. Incumbents all of a sudden became sexy again because everyone, looked over at America and thought that looks a bit unstable and crazy. Maybe we should stick to the devil we know, as the saying goes. And I think the times suited Anthony Albanese. There are some other issues too. I think he's sharpened up his own performance right in the nick of time. And at the same time, some of the economic indicators, at least at a headline level, perhaps people aren't feeling it at the household level yet, but are going in his direction. There's been one interest rate cut. That came at the right time before the campaign for him. And so that kind of changes the mood of the nation in many ways. And unemployment is still low. So there are some metrics that work in the government's favour, even if there has been a cost of living crisis, which I think is absolutely right. There has been, but it's also a global phenomenon.
It is, and I want to touch on that a little bit later, but one of the fears that I've been hearing is there could be a hung parliament. Obviously, you had that in the Gillard years. You're fearing that?
It's funny that the word fear, because I think that's the central question. Do Australians fear it in the same way? Australians certainly did fear it, and there was absolutely the sense that people were concerned that it, led to instability, and Tony Abbott won at the end of the Gillard years very much on the basis that, the hung parliament and the minority government she'd led was chaotic. Now, if you look at actually the way it worked, it wasn't actually very chaotic. He may not have liked the policies, and clearly Australia agreed with him, but it wasn't really chaotic. And as increasing numbers of Australians vote for third parties, independents, the Greens, other options, I think Australians are actually warming to the idea of a government perhaps looking different. Not all of them, I'm not claiming that, but I don't think the sense of hysteria about a minority government is the same. It seems to me, while the major parties want to always govern in majority, and who could blame them, it's obviously easier for them, that they seem a little more accepting of the inevitability of this voting shift that we're seeing in our country, because it's a broader shift. It's Australians from the left and the right are wanting to vote for third options.
In those Gillard years, I was working over there as an Australia correspondent, and there were some very interesting characters to appear in that hung parliament stage, including Bob Katter.
There's an election on in Flinders, and I know who I will back. It's a hard-working man called Katter. Helps anyone on the track.
I've had to lock my door on numerous occasions with female staff trying to get at me and take advantage of me. And, over the years, lucky I've been a man of very strong moral fibre, or I could have been led astray.
I'm a Martian astronaut, Mr. Acting Speaker, I can assure you.
Do we have a repeat of that this time on the scene?
A Bob Katter type?
Yeah.
We have many Bob Katter types. I mean, we've actually got Bob Katter still in there. So, and I suspect if Peter Dutton, by the way, did do better than the opinion polls expect him to, He could cobble together his own minority by approaching some of the more right-leaning independents, people like Bob Katter. If Labor gets closer, though, they have a few pathways. They've made it clear that they don't want to do any deals. I think they're quite stung by the official deal with the Greens in the last parliament. It meant that Tony Abbott was able to really weaponise that against them. Of course, the carbon price was legislated and then Tony Abbott got rid of it. So we've had some turbulent years, as you know, in our country.
Yes.
But I think Labor will be more strategic about the way it forms any potential minority government, and you'll get a couple of people who will guarantee supply but tell them that they will determine each policy on its merits. And so that actually will be more complicated than in the past, because every single piece of legislation and policy will need to be negotiated. But there are so many options for them and pathways. So I don't think it'll necessarily just be one kingmaker. And because there are a few options for Labor, if they only fall short one or two seats, it won't be terribly hard for them to govern, I don't think.
As we've said, the cost of living is dominating this election, and Labor's not necessarily being punished for failing to solve it over the last 3 years.
If you look at some of the recent surveys, it seems that voters, although they are cranky about their cost of living, are giving Labor a bit of credit for at least giving them a bit of help and perhaps having a better cost of living plan for the next couple of years. And so the contest has very much been about dueling kind of goodies for who can get you through the cost of living crisis.
Health, housing and Trump have also dominated, along with building nuclear power plants to deal with the energy crisis.
And so they're the big issues, but then it's a bit of a character contest too. We've got very different leadership styles from these men. Peter Dutton, the opposition leader, has been in politics for a very long time, but he's held a very hardline portfolio. So he's seen as a bit of a hard man in politics, home affairs, defence. He's a former policeman. And so I think that's been used against him in some ways. He's tried to lean into it as a sort of, I'm strong, you can trust me in uncertain times. But you know, the sort of shadow of Trump looms, and he's been painted as a bit of a Trump light. Now, he contests that, and so do his party. They say it's lots of things he's different on. And I think there are some examples of places he has been different and has argued different things. But that perception in voters' minds is definitely baked in, and it's coming up in a lot of the research, and that's giving an advantage to Labor.
Because how has Albanese positioned himself sort of in contrast to that right-wing leaders like Trump?
Albanese struggled originally, but now seems to have found his mojo. So I think at the start, when Dutton was running circles around him, because he was, and that's why they did get ahead in the polls, as you rightly point out, it was kind of almost my observation. I don't think he'd ever concede this, but how I saw his performance, I think he was a bit spooked, right? Like, what's going on here? And it was difficult for him and frustrating. I think now he's got his measure a bit, and more recently he's really tried to emphasise the differences, but as a strength. So when Dutton does the I'm a strong leader and paints the Prime Minister as weak and flip-floppy and, you know, these sorts of derogatory kind of labels, the Prime Minister used a line, kindness isn't weakness. And he really tried to talk up his sort of empathy, that he isn't a hard man, but that he's still tough when he needs to be. And again, I think it's suiting him a bit.
How sort of personal and nasty has this election campaign been? Have they been trading many insults? Has it got nasty on another level, or okay?
No, it's pretty nasty. Yeah, I do think it's pretty nasty.
I mean, that is not true, Prime Minister. It's hard to believe anything you say, of which you should be ashamed of, frankly, over the last 3 years.
All right, you should be ashamed and you're a liar.
Well, Peter can attack me.
If there's anything that sums up the Albanese government, it's not a clue.
And Anthony Albanese called Peter Dutton cold-hearted, mean-spirited, just plain nasty. Peter Dutton called the Prime Minister the weakest Prime Minister since Federation.
OK, well, the Prime Minister has attacked Liberal leader Peter Dutton today, calling him an angry Eeyore. The reference, a nod to the donkey from Winnie the Pooh.
There has been a really negative element to the campaign. And then, of course, there's the sort of shadow campaign, the campaign that happens in your algorithm, not in just proper interviews with people like me. And on that front, yeah, it's been really, really, really negative. But I think political campaigning often is. I mean, you don't get much, I don't know, the Obama Hope campaign feels like a long time ago, doesn't it? We are living in times where I think that kind of negativity is often where politicians go. And so you'd have to say both of them are responsible for some of that tone.
Oh, it's easy clickbait. Has there been, though, any sort of controversies or dramas this election?
I think there have been, but they've largely been on the coalition side. I say largely because it's certainly not entirely, but after the first period, there was a policy which was called the wanting to end working from home for public servants that the coalition announced. They said they wanted to get public servants in Canberra back in the office. Now, this policy went down like a lead balloon in the community because the signal to women was that these guys were backward thinking, and MPs that I spoke to were really furious that their party had announced this. Then Peter Dutton, the opposition leader, stands up and backflips on it and says, we got it wrong, this isn't our policy anymore.
It took just over a week for the first major backflip of the federal election campaign. Peter Dutton sensationally scrapping plans to stop public servants working from home.
This is where we are right now.
Where he is losing female voters, so upset with his return to work policy that he's dumping it mid-campaign.
I've apologised for the decision that we took in relation to work from home.
And not just once.
We got it wrong. As I say, we made a mistake in relation to the work from home policy, and we've apologised for it.
I've been around a while. I have never seen in a campaign a policy dumped like that. And so I think that was quite a spectacular moment. I remember thinking, what? And I called everyone who knows even more than me, and they were like, no, I haven't seen a backflip like this either.
But it wasn't enough to get a certain age group in Australia excited about the campaigns. New research has revealed those under 40 are the most disengaged this election. It seems they just don't care.
For some Australians, the upcoming federal election is barely on their radar.
I'm not even enrolled to vote. Yeah, what age do you have to be?
They don't have job security, they're working contract to contract, they're renting, or they're steeped in mortgage payments.
How problematic is this? Like, how do politicians actually get them on board and start caring about what's happening?
Well, it's a good point, because not only do they not care, but millennials and Gen Z will now be the majority of voters in Australia. Now, goodbye boomers. My generation, I think I'm a Zennial, actually. I'm sort of in the middle there. But no one cares about us. Look, but the truth is young people are going to be, they're the biggest block, they're the sleeper block. They don't answer phones very often to give pollsters their ideas. They are unpredictable politically. They can be left-wing on some things, quite conservative on other things. So you shouldn't make assumptions about where they'll, tick the box. They do not feel rusted onto the main parties, which of course is scary for the main parties. And they, I think, will determine the election. Now, that's why both parties have been trying to pitch to them, and you see them on all of the socials, and they're trying to get on TikTok and all of the stuff, thinking that will convince them. The truth is there's a lot of double haters in this country who aren't that excited by either leader. But like all elections around the world, they often get decided by who you kind of hate a bit less. You don't have to love the person you vote for. You just have to be convinced they're maybe not as bad as the other one. And so I think that's what the government is hoping, at the very least. I'm sure they're hoping for more, but the very least returns them to power.
The lesser of two evils. What I do love is you guys famously have some sort of quirky polling day traditions to lure out the voters. I think it's called democracy sausage from memory. Talk us through this.
We do. Although I'm worried about the democracy sausages. So yes, we love a sausage in our country, and we do have sausage sizzles at all of the polling booths, which are at, all of the schools and different places across the country. But the old days where everyone would turn up on the Saturday and vote in compulsory voting, which we love and are very proud of, are kind of increasingly diminishing because people are pre-polling increasingly. And so I just hope that the sausage stands can still be successful because, of course, they're great fundraising opportunities for lots of schools and organisations and volunteer organisations. So, but yeah, I'm sure people will just turn up anyway to get a sausage, even if they've pre-polled. That's how big a tradition it is. Most people I know have already voted.
Have you?
Officially. So I have voted. I'm in a seat that's very safe these days, so I don't think anyone cares much for my vote. But in the places that matter, I can tell you, every single vote is being fought over. I feel a little underloved in my electorate, actually. When an electorate isn't being fiercely fought over, you can barely get a leaflet. But in some of these marginal electorates that are swinging, boy, oh boy, is it intense there.
It's interesting because from across the ditch on this side, your election has seemed a bit dry, a little bit boring, Is that fair, or on the ground, is it a whole lot hotter?
Look, I think it's a really great election because there are some good elements to this election. There are some big ideas, a nuclear future, renewables backed up with firming future. These are big things, even though it's been seen as a little banal. I think the men themselves, who are our candidates, are kind of probably not the most inspiring figures, both of them. So that can make it seem a bit banal. But, there's a lot at stake. And I think the issues that people are passionate about, housing, intergenerational unfairness, these are very passionate issues. And there's a lot of activity around all of those issues. So may not translate into love of leader, but certainly people are very active on the issues.
Now, one of my favourites for you guys is Pauline Hanson for all sorts of reasons as part of being a journo.
Pauline Hanson whipped out the tongs.
I'm imagining we do this, we're going to get some fat spitting in our faces.
I've had more than fat spat in my face. I believe we are in danger of being swamped by Asians.
Are you xenophobic? Please explain.
In 2017, Pauline Hanson wore a burqa to Parliament Question Time as part of a stunt where she called for the religious garments to be banned, citing concerns for national security.
Fellow Australians, if you are seeing me now, it means I have been murdered.
Is she still about leading One Nation? Because I also hear her daughter is running as well this year, if that's right.
She is in Tasmania. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, she is leading One Nation. Not only is she leading One Nation, but if the polling is showing that One Nation is actually doing pretty well, and that's really interesting. Some of that reason is perhaps people who are frustrated with the Conservatives and are moving to other right-wing options, so that's giving her a benefit.
In a speech last night, John Howard said the policies of the One Nation Party are wrong and Pauline Hanson's cure would be worse than the disease.
Back in the old days, I'm old enough to remember when John Howard said put One Nation last. Been a big change in Australia. One Nation has evolved as well, though I expect Pauline Hanson's One Nation will have some success, particularly in the Senate in our upper house.
Now, you just mentioned John Howard, and for me, and forgive me if I'm wrong, he seems to be the last sort of stable Prime Minister for Australia, because I was over there for 2008, and if I go through this, I think it was Kevin Rudd rolled by Julia Gillard, there was a hung parliament, then Gillard was rolled by Kevin Rudd, you had Tony Abbott, he got in, he was rolled by Malcolm Turnbull, then Scott Morrison, now Anthony Albanese. It's been a roller coaster. Why so topsy-turvy and unstable for your government?
Oh, we just had a period, I don't even think we've quite worked it out, what quite happened, a combination of turbulent times and also, I think, character flaws, if I'm to be honest, and parties finding it too easy to turf them out because of the rules. Rules have been changed for the parties. It's harder now, I think, to just get rid of your leader very quickly, and some lessons have been learned. So it looks to Anthony Albanese, if he is successful tomorrow, will be, the only leader since John Howard to win 2 consecutive elections. So that's history as well, and I'm sure he's got his eye on that.
That's all for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. Thank you to Patricia Carvelis. This episode was produced by Alexia Russell and engineered by Phil Benj. I'm Amanda Gillies. Mā te wā.